بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أصحاب السعادة، السيدات والسادة، أسعد الله مساءكم جميعا بكل خير. بسم الله وعلى بركة الله نبدأ الموسم الثقافي ال25 لدار الآثار الإسلامية، وباسم المرشد العام لدار الآثار الإسلامية الشيخ حصة صباح سالم الصباح، وباسم جميع العاملين والمتطوعين أرحب بكم أجمل ترحيب، متمنيا أن يكون هذا الموسم موسم خير على الجميع، ونحن متفائلون به لأنه سيكون موسما حافلا بالعديد من الأنشطة التي تشمل المعارض في الخارج والأنشطة الفنية التي توفر الفرص لكسب المزيد من المعرفة والثقافة، ودورات مكثفة للصغار والكبار. ونحن هنا نعاهد أصدقاء الدار وجميع من مد اليد إلى الدار بمختلف الطرق ومول أنشطتها بأننا ماضون في تكثيف أنشطتنا والحرص على الرقي في نوعية هذه الأنشطة. هذا الموسم يمثل محطة رئيسية بالنسبة لي شخصياً. هذا الموسم يعني أنني أمضيت 25 سنة من العمل التطوعي لدار الآثار الإسلامية، أي ربع قرن من العشق المستمر للدار. أعتقد أنني محظوظ في ذلك، وأملي أن تستمر محبتكم لما نقدمه من أنشطة ثقافية ومعرفية مميزة، وأن يبقى تواجدكم معنا وتشجيعكم لنا. Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the opening of the 25th cultural season of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. This month, the Dar is celebrating the 25th anniversary of its cultural seasons. On behalf of Sheikh Hussa Sabah Salim al-Sabah, the Director General of Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah, all the employees and volunteers, I welcome you and hope that you will enjoy what we have planned for you this season. As usual, it is rich with lectures and musical evenings, and there are also more programs and activities for the young ones. Film nights will continue to introduce interesting features. This is an opportune time to remind you, members, to renew your membership with Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah. If you are a member, if you are not, we encourage you to become one. Stop hesitating. The lady in the shop will assist you to fill the form. 25 years ago, after Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah wing in the Kuwait National Museum was looted and burned, the Dar was without offices, even computers and mailing lists. Nevertheless, it's reorganized, renewed old contacts, and contacted lawyer friends. The Dar began sponsoring lectures in borrowed rooms. Together with the Dar's traveling exhibitions, Islamic art and patronage treasures from Kuwait, which was already in Leningrad, at that time it was St. Petersburg, or now it's St. Petersburg, then was Leningrad. The early lectures and the traveling exhibitions were the revival and extensions of the Dar's activities prior to 1990. Kuwait is blessed with two famous collections of art, the Sabah collection and the Tareq Sayid Rajab Museum collection. And it is blessed with loyal friends. The participation of the Tareq Rajab Museum and the lecture series has been there from the start and has continued to this day. In commemoration of this warm friendship, Dar al-Athar al-Islamiyyah has named the first lecture of the season the Tareq Rajab lecture, to recognize the good deeds that your father did. It has become the custom for Dr. Ziad Sayid Rajab to deliver that lecture. And we are honored tonight on our 25th anniversary that he is celebrating with us by delivering a talk entitled Important Manuscript in the Tareq Rajab Museum, The Lives of the Calligraphers. Dr. Ziad is a joint owner of the Tareq Rajab Museum, among his other responsibilities. I don't think Dr. Ziad brought his mobile phone with him tonight. So in recognition with this good deed, I ask you to please turn off your mobile phones and let's welcome Dr. Ziad Sayid Rajab.
Thank you, Mr. Bejan. And really the honor is all mine, Sheikh Hissa. Thank you for, again, having me to give this lecture. And thank you all, Your Excellencies and guests, for being here. I see we've got quite a nice audience this evening. I was talking to Sheikh Hissa a little earlier on about the lecture and how every year I promise myself that as soon as the lecture is done, I'm going to choose my next. And of course, I procrastinate, and I end up swatting in August. But I was also saying it's actually quite difficult choosing a subject to talk about, because going through the museum, which has beautiful things, of course, you think, how can I bring that to life, to make it more interesting? I don't just want to talk about a bit of writing. Things are much more interesting if they have a little story. So actually looking for those stories is what I like to do in these talks. And so I hope I have made it a little interesting. If not, you can throw a cabbage. And so, as I said, well, as Mr. Bejan said, I'm going to talk about some of the manuscripts in the museum. We have quite a large collection of manuscripts and books in the museum from all periods, and obviously written by dozens and dozens of different calligraphers. Some of them are signed, and others, no less beautiful than the signed ones, are not signed, unknown scribes. The ones that we've got plenty of signed ones, some from quite well-known calligraphers, and others extremely well-known and important ones. So to try to focus the subject today, and it's such a broad area, I've decided to choose only those calligraphers that we have represented in the museum who've actually made crucial contributions to the development of the Arabic and Islamic script. However, to start off, I need to mention three calligraphers that we don't have represented in the museum, and it's because they actually laid the foundations for the formalization of Arabic script. So, I forgot I've got this. So the history of Arabic, just very briefly, goes back arguably sometime between the 3rd and the 6th centuries AD. And as I said, I'm not going to go into that discussion. There are scripts dating from the earliest days of Islam, such as scripts called Jazm, Ma'il, as well as variants of these. But it's the Kufic script, seen there in this beautiful page from the very famous Blue Quran, 9th century AD. So it's the Kufic script where Arabic actually starts to fall into the form that one can recognize today, even though, that is quite difficult to read. Kufic script is considered to be among the oldest of the true Arabic scripts and dates back to sometime between 622 AD up until the 9th century. Because of the name, most historians describe Kufic as having been developed mainly in Kufa, which was an important early Islamic city and a capital of the Abbasid Empire just for a few years from between 749 and 762 AD. But certain scholars, such as Nabil Safwat, I have to say, claim that it's probably more accurate to say that most of the script's development took place in Baghdad and that the name Kufic wasn't actually contemporary. It's argued that, well, they called it something else, but others state that it's just a convenient label that refers to a group of calligraphic styles in use from the beginning of Islam. Some of the development of the script must have taken place in Kufa, as the city was founded by the earliest Muslims in around 638 AD, and Baghdad was only established almost 150 years after that. But Kufic was actually in use in Medina first. There are inscriptions dated around 625 AD showing that. Of course, Baghdad was a great cultural melting pot, and it was where the Arabic script began to be developed into new styles. And over the course of its 500-year history, as the capital of the Abbasid Empire, it was where calligraphy was developed into a fine art. There were several contributors that aren't generally well known, for example, in the 7th century, but most historians and scholars agree that the formal development of Arabic happened in 3 phases, with the first phase being undertaken by Ibn Muqla, who was Abu Ali Muhammad ibn Ali ibn al-Hussein ibn Muqla. And don't have that. Oh, just go back a bit. Oh, well. So some sources state that he was born in Baghdad in 886 AD, but it's not very clear. Some people say he wasn't. But it's known that he lived most of his life there, and he was in the service as a scribe of the Abbasid dynasty and was the chief librarian of the state library. I've put this in because I really like this book, which is al-Hariri's Maqamat, where he's got some lovely pictures of contemporary life in Baghdad at the time. Now, Ibn Muqla suffered many trials and tribulations in his lifetime. He got into trouble. Things seemed to happen to him in threes. So he got into trouble with the 18th Abbasid Caliph, al-Muqtadir, who had him sacked from his position in 928, confiscated his property, exiled him to Shiraz. And when the next caliph came into power, Ibn Muqla went back to court, but he kept getting involved in conspiracies and plots involving viziers and military chiefs and rival factions, gaining high positions sometimes and losing them. He was so much involved in all these conspiracies that in 938 AD, he was arrested and his enemies had his right hand amputated. But that didn't stop him from writing. He continued to write, practicing with his left hand, and unfortunately, his enemies again got the better of him and amputated his left hand. And then they got the better of him again, threw him into prison. Unfortunately, he had his tongue cut out, after which he got an infection and died. He was buried in prison, but that didn't seem to be enough, so he was exhumed and buried in his son's house, and exhumed again and buried in his wife's house, so 3 times, never resting even in death. And incidentally, although less well known, his brother, Abu Abdullah ibn Muqla, was also a player during this phase, and the phase involved identifying that there was actually a need for a system of proportion that would make writing easier to replicate and make it much more elegant. So he had, Ibn Muqla, a very good knowledge of mathematics and geometry, so he was actually quite well positioned to undertake the development of what is called proportioned writing, or in Arabic, al-Khatt al-Mansub. And so al-Khatt al-Mansub is attributed to him. He's considered to be the founder of Arabic cursive writing, and by the 9th century, there were many styles of cursive writing with varying degrees of attractiveness, but it was Ibn Muqla who actually set down the rules for a perfectly proportioned and attractive script with various rules such as the use of a square dot as a unit of measurement, which we can see in this chart here. So everything was defined very accurately. He applied his rules to the 6 major scripts, the cursive scripts of the time, which are Nasikh, and those are the 6 scripts: Nasikh, Thulth, Riqa', Tawqi', Rihan, and Muhaqqaq. I mean, really, to the untrained eye, some of them look quite similar, but there are differences between them. And so I've just got some beautiful examples of, like this is Nasikh, books we have in the museum. That's a beautiful, this is from a poem called Qasidat al-Barda by a famous writer, and this is an Ottoman piece written in Thulth. This is Muhaqqaq from a Mamluk manuscript, and this one unfortunately is not in our museum, it's in the Chester Beatty Museum in beautiful Rayhan. And finally, Tawqi' and Riqa'. So he set down the basic rules, and we now come to the next phase, which was Ibn al-Bawwab, who was a student of Ibn Muqla. I've just put these because these are supposedly the only surviving manuscripts by Ibn Muqla, which are in a museum apparently in Iraq. Ibn al-Bawwab. Now, Ibn al-Bawwab followed on from Ibn Muqla's precise and mathematical Khat al-Mansub, and he added more elegance to the methods, taking it into an even more elevated visual art. And as I just said, only one of his works, authenticated works, survive. This beautiful book written in Rihan, which is in the Chester Beatty Museum in Dublin. He was born Abu al-Hassan Ali bin Hilal in around 961 AD, although nobody really knows the exact date and the exact place of birth, but it's certain that he did live most of his life in Baghdad and died there in 1022 AD. He came from a very modest family. His name, Ibn al-Bawwab, means the son of the gatekeeper, which was his father's profession. And later on, when his career became very illustrious, he was often teased by people at court about his humble beginnings. He was a student of a very famous grammarian linguist of the time, and was also taught calligraphy by a very famous calligrapher called Muhammad ibn Asad, who was the foremost calligrapher of his day. He started his working life as a decorator of ceilings and walls, which he did for a time before he went on to make seals, and finally becoming established in the field of calligraphy. He became a master in the style of Ibn Muqla, apparently having learned the style from Ibn Muqla's daughter. And he became famous for his perfection of the proportioned script, as well as adding to the other scripts, such as Nasikh, Muhaqqaq, etc. He was apparently somewhat of an eccentric, with an extremely long beard, and a penchant for very brightly colored turbans, and he especially apparently favored yellow turbans. Knowledge about the methods and styles of Ibn al-Bawwab is taken from a treatise that he wrote on calligraphy called Ra'ya fil Khat, which is actually a beautiful poem. I've read it in Arabic, and in the poem he describes how to prepare pens and how to prepare paper and ink and how to approach calligraphy properly. And how to study and experiment and practice and so on. It's a very nice poem. Now, he spent most of his life in Baghdad, but he also served as librarian to Sultan Baha' Dawla in Shiraz, Buyid Sultan, in the late 10th century. And one of his tasks, which was given to him by the Sultan, was to assemble all the works of Ibn Muqla, 30 volumes of his Quran. He managed to find 29, and under great pressure from the Sultan to find the 30th one. Well, he couldn't. So he describes later in his writing how he hunted in the palace library and found old paper that looked like Ibn Muqla's paper, which was beautiful Samarkand and Chinese paper. So he took the paper. He was an expert at Ibn Muqla's writing, so he copied his writing and wrote out the final volume of the Quran on this old paper. And then he took one of the bindings from one of the old volumes, put it on the new one, and put the new one on one of the old ones, and no one was the wiser. So that was he obviously was expert at the style of writing which Ibn Muqla had invented. He was also a famous mosque preacher. Again, I've just put you, it's not him, but I like the image from Hariri's book, the Maqamat, and he's said to have copied 64 Qur'ans and taught many students who spread his methods. Now, we have the third phase, is a famous calligrapher called Yaqut al-Mustasimi, but before I mention him, I'd like to mention someone else whom, again, we don't have represented in the museum, but who I found very interesting, first of all, because she's a woman, and also because she had such an influence on Yaqut al-Mustasimi's work, our next calligrapher. So her name is Shuhda bint al-Ibri, and her full name was Shuhda bint Ahmed ibn Farraj al-Ibri, who was a famous writer and calligrapher, and she was called Fakhr al-Nisa, which means the pride of womanhood, by her contemporaries. She was actually one of the foremost scholars of her age. Her father was quite an important person in Baghdad, and he was in the habit of taking Shuhda to meetings with scholars. So he'd go to the diwaniyas, the majalis, and he'd take his daughter with him from when she was around 8 years old. Just another image from the Maqamat. She studied the hadith under famous people, which in around 1100 AD, apparently, and her father found her many scholars to teach her. She became very, very famous for her knowledge of the hadith, so people would actually go to her for interpretations. And it might seem unlikely to us today, but in fact at the time it wasn't unheard of for women to be considered reliable sources of information. She excelled at calligraphy and became known as Shuhda, the calligrapher, having followed and learnt the style of Ibn al-Bawwab. She was mentioned in a famous book in the 13th century called The Death of Nobles by a scholar called Ibn Khalkan, who wrote a biographical encyclopedia of Arab personalities and scholars. And he described her as, quote, the pride of women, Baghdad-born, a scholar who wrote with a good hand, and who died on a Sunday afternoon on the 13th of Muharram, 574 AH, Hijri. And following her death, prayers were said for her at the palace mosque with a huge number of people attending, and she was 90 years of age. She was married to a very well-known man who was quite prominent in the court and who actually built a college on the banks of the Tigris. And apparently it was because of this exposure to the court that she came in contact with Yaqut al-Mustasimi, although personally I believe it wasn't direct contact, because I mean, looking at the time she was alive and the time Yaqut al-Mustasimi was alive, there seems to be a gap of a few years, but who knows? Anyway, most scholars, most sources say that Yaqut al-Mustasimi learned from Shuhda. Now, Yaqut al-Mustasimi, our next calligrapher, was born Abu al-Majd Jamal al-Din Yaqut in the late 12th, early 13th century in Anatolia, in the region of Amasya, which is there, yeah, in the northeast Anatolia. When he was very young, he was either captured or sold as a slave, and he was carted off to the Abbasid court where he served as a slave. Probably because he was very bright and intelligent, he received an excellent education in the caliph's court and was very fortunate to be trained under a very famous musician and writer on the theory of music and a composer, and someone who was working at the court at the time. He was also fortunate to be able to study under very well-known calligraphers, including, so they say, Shuhda bint al-Ibri, who apparently had a significant influence on his work. Yaqut learned through what was called the chain of transmission, which is learning the knowledge passing from master to student in a tedious, very hard-working method of copying and then gaining the master's skills. So he learned through the chain using the scripts and styles of Ibn Muqla and Ibn al-Bawab as his models. He, of course, worked on the 6 styles of writing and became very proficient in them. And once he'd become a master of calligraphy and his work began taking on a creativity of his own, he developed his own script, which people call Yaquti, which is apparently a form of thulth. By this time, he'd reached his writing maturity in all the scripts, and he achieved an excellence that surpassed even Ibn al-Bawab. He refined the scripts to a level of beauty never achieved before, and it said he had had a vision one day in which the Nasikh script was revealed to him in the form that he should take it. And subsequent to this vision, he worked really hard to actually achieve what he saw in his vision, constantly refining his work. He was also famous for having changed the pen nib, which, as you can see in this picture, like there, was flat. And Yaqut al-Mustasimi changed it to the oblique pen, as in that picture there. So he altered the rules of writing and the method. He was ultimately in the service of the last caliph, al-Mustasim, the last caliph of the Abbasid Empire, from whom he received his formal name, Yaqut al-Mustasimi. And the caliph accorded him such favor and status that it's often said that his high achievements were a result of this. And Yaqut was always striving for this favor to continue and for it to spread also to his students. And he'd write daily and bring his work for the caliph to have a look at. But despite this, the caliph never stopped praising Ibn al-Bawab and telling Yaqut that his work, although excellent, was not as good as Ibn al-Bawab's work. Of course, this depressed Yaqut al-Mustasimi a little bit, so in an effort to try and change the mind of the caliph, he took some of his work one day and Ibn al-Bawab's work, and he labeled Ibn al-Bawab's as his own and his own as Ibn al-Bawab's. And the caliph, of course, not knowing what was going on, picked out Ibn al-Bawab's work and praised it as he always did. And Yaqut exclaimed aloud and thanked God that the caliph had deemed worthy the work of his humble slave. The caliph, however, wasn't amused, and angry at this deception, he ceased to show any favor towards Yaqut, and it was a very long time before he gained even a little bit of that favor. And apparently when he lost the favor, it said that Yaqut's work actually deteriorated a bit. Before the Mongol invasion of 1258, Yaqut was the chief librarian of a famous college in Baghdad called the Mustansiriya College, and which was founded in 1227 by the Caliph al-Mustansir, and in which many disciplines were taught, such as the sciences, maths, literature, philosophy, religion, and calligraphy. He wrote several important treatises, including one on calligraphy, which unfortunately hasn't survived. And he was a very strict master and teacher, and was a workaholic, producing at least 2 sections of the Quran every day. During the Mongol invasion of Baghdad in 1258, it is widely believed, based on later reports, that Yaqut took refuge in a minaret and practiced his calligraphy to keep his sanity from, and to avoid looking at what was going on down below. Now, there's quite a well-known 16th century miniature showing him in the minaret practicing his calligraphy while the city was being pillaged below him. And I managed to get this from a publication from the Freer Sackler Museum, which is held in Russia, the original manuscripts. Couldn't get a color one, unfortunately. So the Mongols, of course, were in the habit of actually capturing skilled people. So he was actually captured by Hulagu's army and carted off. No, actually, he stayed in Baghdad, and his career actually flourished a lot under the new rule. And when Hulagu, who was the Mongol leader at the time, appointed a governor of Iraq called Ala ad-Din Juwaini, Yaqut was kept by this governor, and he was appointed treasurer of the Mustansiriya library. Many writers and historians have praised and written about him, and such as al-Dhahabi, a 13th century historian who wrote that Yaqut was the creator of the slanted script, Byzantine in origin, but raised in the court of the caliphs. And he had access to the works of Ibn al-Bawwab, which he learned and upon which he developed and improved. He was also an imam. He is reported to have written 1,001 copies of the Quran in his fine hand, and his school of writing, a very important school, became a style and model followed by calligraphers for centuries. In the museum, we do have a very beautiful book by Yaqut al-Mustasimi, and this is the front of the book, done in a type of Rihan script with titles written in Tawqi', which are not very clear there. Maybe you can just make it out on the bottom. And the colophon of the book, well, that's inside the book, beautiful writing, and the colophon at the back says that this book was written in the 6th month of the year AH 681, which is 1282 AD, in the city of peace, which of course is Baghdad. And now we jump to the 14th century to Abdullah Sayrafi, who some sources say lived in Tabriz all his life, although there are a couple of sources saying he actually lived in Baghdad, but it seems much more likely that, in fact, it was Tabriz. A lot of his monumental work was done in Tabriz, specifically inscriptions for buildings. He's one of the most distinguished calligraphers of the 14th century and followed the school, as most people did at the time, Yaqut al-Mustasimi. And he was very important in bringing this school of calligraphy to the Eastern Islamic world. He started writing when he was very young and displayed a great interest in writing from very early on. His father was a money changer, hence his name, Sayrafi. In Arabic, Sarraf is a money changer. And it's said that one day he was practicing writing in his father's shop when some gold coins were stolen, without Sayrafi being aware, as he'd been concentrating so hard on his writing. When he realized what had happened, he fled to a nearby cemetery to hide from his father, who unfortunately found him, beat him up, and broke 2 of his fingers. Afterwards, Abdullah fell asleep and had a dream about al-Khidr. There was a shrine to al-Khidr in Failaka. And in this dream, al-Khidr asked him what had happened, and he explained, upon which the Prophet rubbed his hands and made a blessing in which he wished that Abdullah would become as accomplished as Yaqut al-Mustasimi. His father was, of course, distraught at having beaten Abdullah, and after this always strongly encouraged his writing, praising him continuously. And this is, it is said, what helped him become the master he was. And he became a grand master of the Muhaqqaq and Thulth scripts. He was trained, of course, in the 6 scripts, and his monumental inscriptions is what he's most famous for. He had a very famous mentor and teacher called Sayid Haydar Nafis, who was a student of Yaqut al-Mustasimi. And he was commissioned to produce inscriptions by many key figures of the time, including the daughter of one of the princes, and a very elaborate building which no longer exists called the Dimashqiya Madrasa. In the 15th century, his work was held in very high regard and was copied by many very famous calligraphers like Ja'far Tabrizi. He's known as the author of an important work on calligraphy called Risala fi Ilm al-Khat, which is held in a library in Turkey. And he's also credited with being the author of the first volume of the great Mongol Shahnama, which was produced for the Timurid rulers. Works of his are held, quite a few works in museums in Turkey, including in the Topkapi and the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Culture. And we have a very nice book in the museum by Abdullah Sayrafi, written in Nasakh and Thulth. And I did have a picture of the inside, but I seem to have forgotten it. But this is the back page where you can see the style of script he used throughout the book with his signature. He died in around 1345 or 1346 and is buried in Tabriz. And now, moving on a little bit, we come to, that's the Colophon, which actually shows the previous ownership or the historical ownership of this book. Now we go to the Timurid Empire and to Baysangur, who was a Timurid prince born in 1397 and who was a grandson of Timur, or as he's known in the West, Tamerlane, who was the founder of the Timurid Empire, which was quite a large empire at the time. And he was the son of Shahrukh, who was the second ruler of the empire. His mother, called Gohar Shad, was the most senior of Shahrukh's wives and was herself a great patron of the arts. Baysangur was also a great patron of the arts, and due to the fact that he wasn't considered to be in line to the Timurid throne, he is actually able to devote a lot of his time to the arts and to intellectual pursuits. Until recently, not much was known about him. Much more was known about his older brother, Ulugh Bek, who was Shahrukh's successor. But as a ruler and as an artist and an intellectual, most people today, a lot of scholars today consider Baysangur really the most talented amongst his brothers. He held several positions before he became the ruler, including Governor General of several provinces, as well as being on the High Council of State. He also held the regency when his father was absent from the capital. He loved Herat, and although he was required to be elsewhere, Herat was the capital at the time, he was always keen to go back because of the rich cultural life in the city. He spoke, of course, Turkic language, his mother tongue, along with being fluent in Arabic and Persian. During this period, the Timurid leaders were very interested in culture and the arts, and partly because they wanted to promote their prestige by making their courts centers of culture, just as older courts like the Abbasid court had been. They were interested in grand and monumental architecture, and they gathered all kinds of artists and craftspeople and scholars from around the Islamic world, attracting them. And Timur initiated this pattern, of course, in order to glorify himself and his dynasty. But with his descendants, including Baysangur, this became innate, and they were, in fact, extremely interested and talented in the arts themselves. Baysangur himself was involved in many artistic projects, and it was, in fact, him who wrote the calligraphy for the tiles that were to be installed in the mosque that was commissioned by his mother, Gohar Shad, in Mashhad. And this can still be seen on the tiles that are in Thulth on blue background. He was also interested in poetry and was a great collector of poetry and a keen historian. And one of his major interests was the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings. And he's famous for having especially commissioned a Shahnameh based on Ferdowsi's, and which was called the Baysangur Shahnameh. Unfortunately, we don't have any of them. They're so beautiful, I've put 3 pictures here. Because, I mean, some people say the poetry was written by his own hand, although that's argued about because of the time it would have taken to write it. So I've got 3 beautiful pictures from this Baysangur Shahnameh. Baysangur was also famous for having commissioned a grand and very monumental Quran, which is called the Baysangur Quran. This was a huge book that was copied in 7 lines on one side of a vellum sheet, meaning there would have been probably 800 pages in this book, which was a massive, massive book. The book used to be in the mausoleum of Timur in Samarkand, which still exists, and it remained there until Nadir Shah in the 18th century and his troops invaded the city in the 18th century, and the book was taken apart, many of its pages either stolen or lost. Now, the Quran is called the Baysangur Quran, and many historians claim it was written by him, but some scholars today argue that this undertaking was so great, again, like the Shahnameh, it would have been practically impossible for him to write, being so busy. So rather than actually being written by him, some people today say that it was commissioned by him, probably with a lot of contribution in terms of style and design. Other scholars actually say that it was commissioned by his grandfather, Timur, and was kept on a great marble stand in the Friday Mosque of Samarkand, which still exists today, as the technical details of the book seem to fit in with the specifications of the stand. But there's controversy surrounding this too, because others state that it was actually commissioned, this stand, by Ulugh Bek, who was Baysangur's brother. So it is feasible that Baysangur actually contributed to this. But whatever the origin, it's a very important piece of work and a masterpiece of the period. And we're very fortunate to have this. This is just 2 lines from, and this is quite big. It's like that. So you can imagine the size of the page. This is written in Muhaqqaq, although Nabil Safwat, who studied this piece, says it was actually a hybrid of Muhaqqaq, Nasakh, and Thulth. Baysangur had 5 wives, 8 children, and he died in 1433, aged just 37 years old, it is said, due to an excessive fondness for alcohol. And he's buried in the Gohar Shad Madrasa complex in Herat, parts of which still exist today. Now we jump to the 15th century and to Sheikh Hamdullah al-Amasi, who is considered to be the founder of the Ottoman school of calligraphy. Now, Ottoman calligraphy had become an established art form, of course, before his period, and was based on the Baghdad school of calligraphy. But Sheikh Hamdullah was the one who gave the Ottoman school its distinctive character. The Baghdad school, as we mentioned earlier, had been actually refined by Yaqut al-Mustasimi, and the original Ottoman school was based on that. He came from a family of very well-known scholars, and so he had an extremely good education. He was also born in Amasya, where Yaqut al-Mustasimi was born, and reputedly to a family that had immigrated to Amasya some generations before, perhaps from Bukhara. And he was born in the 1420s or 30s. He studied calligraphy under famous calligraphers, as well as his own father, who was also a very well-known scholar at the time. One day, at one of his father's assemblies, he met Prince Bayezid, an Ottoman prince who was the governor of Amasya province at the time. Now, Bayezid was very well versed in literature, in Turkish, Arabic, and Persian literature, and music, and being a very scholarly man, he appointed Hamdullah to be calligraphy instructor. Upon his enthronement in 1481 AD, Bayezid II brought Sheikh Hamdullah to Istanbul, where he was appointed writing instructor at the court and given several properties, one to live in, one to work in, and as well as the revenue of some villages. And he was subsequently referred to as the calligrapher of Sultan Bayezid II. They developed a very close relationship, and Bayezid was so in awe of Hamdullah that he'd hold his inkpot for him while he was writing. This very close relationship caused considerable jealousy in the court, and there was subsequently a lot of animosity towards Sheikh Hamdullah, and this was very apparent to the Sultan at the time. So one day the Sultan invited all the scholars to a gathering and gathered a piece of work by each one of them, put them all in a pile, and then got a Quran written by Sheikh Hamdullah and put it at the bottom of the pile. This caused a lot of consternation, and the scholars said it was very disrespectful to put the Quran at the bottom of the pile, to which the Sultan replied, yes, and it's very disrespectful to put your work on top of Sheikh Hamdullah's. And so apparently that animosity ceased from then. And with the encouragement and the patronage of Bayezid, who had a very artistic vision, Hamdullah built on the Abbasid forms of calligraphy, resulting in an innovative and distinct style. Ottoman biographers have recorded that Hamdullah had never seen Mustasimi's work, but this has been proved wrong, of course. He did know the work very well, and there were two distinctive periods of his work. The earlier period, which was based on Yaqut's style and which was called the Amasya period, and then the second period, which he developed himself, which was called the Istanbul period. And Hamdullah actually held Yaqut al-Mustasimi in very high reverence, and thus, when the Sultan told him that he wanted Sheikh Hamdullah to develop a new style that could give a new identity to the Ottoman Empire, it went against the grain for him to actually change Yaqut al-Mustasimi's work. But with a lot of pressure from the Sultan, he actually did manage to start creating a new style. And so he did create this new identity for Ottoman writing. He lived a very Sufi-type lifestyle, despite the luxurious surroundings he lived in. And according to the Ottomans, after Hamdullah, the Mustasimi style was virtually abandoned in the Muslim world in favor of Hamdullah's, but this is probably only true for the Ottoman Empire itself. His students included the Sultan himself, princes, senior official scholars, and poets. And after the death of Bayezid II in 1512, he went into a retreat. Bayezid's son, Salim I, then ascended the throne and tried to coax Hamdullah into coming back to court and in producing the Quran for him. However, Hamdullah refused, saying it was too big a work for him to do at that age. Several of his works exist in museums in Turkey, including in the Topkapi and the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts. Apparently, Sheikh Hamdullah was also a very accomplished archer, and there's a stone in Istanbul which was erected to proclaim that Hamdullah had split a companion's arrow from a distance of the equivalent of 730 meters, and the inscription on the stone read, "The furthest distance achieved by Hamdullah, the son of Sheikh Mustafa, chief calligrapher and the Sheikh of archers." And Bayezid appointed him the master of archers. And apparently he was also a very accomplished tailor. He died in 1520 and was buried in a cemetery in Uskudar, where many famous Ottoman men and women were buried. And he's considered to be one of the 7 masters of the Ottoman school of calligraphy. And we have 2 books of his, actually. This one, 15th century, with writing in Nasikh, as well as, let's see inside. And we also have this lovely one, which was written 1501 AD, accomplished. And that's, now we come to our next calligrapher called Ahmad Shamsuddin Karahisari. His last name is connected to the town that he was born in, Karahisar, which is a town in southwest Turkey. He was born in 1470 and died in 1566 AD. Not much information about his early life, but it's known that he went to Istanbul at an early age for his education, and he remained there till he died. He was a Sufi and undertook Sufi training in Istanbul. And historical sources state that he had a very delicate build, he was very thin and dressed very elegantly. It's believed he came under the influence of a calligrapher from Iran called Asadullah Kermani, and that he was thus influenced to follow the Yaqut al-Mustarsimi school of calligraphy rather than Sheikh Hamdullah. He brought a new influence and style to the style of al-Mustarsimi, particularly with Nasikh and Thulth, and this new style was extremely highly regarded in the Ottoman Empire and beyond. He was like a magnet, gathering many artists around him who were interested in his innovations. He was also known to be very actively in competition with others through letters and with poetry, and most famously with an artist called Ibrahim Effendi, to whom he sent very critical and very scathing letters and poetry. However, they did eventually meet in Istanbul and became very firm friends. He produced very many works, including Qur'ans, and when under the patronage of Suleiman the Magnificent, he produced one of his most important works, kept in the Topkapi, a Quran of 300 pages. And there are several others in the Topkapi and in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Arts. He produced monumental works too, including the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, a writing on the dome. The writing disappeared apparently, but was copied and redone again in his style. And there are also his inscriptions in the tomb of the architect Sinan. He was around 90 when he died, and he was buried in a famous tomb along with famous character Jamaluddin Karamani. And the inscription he'd designed himself for his own grave. Now we just have one little, that was one of his works at the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. We have just one of his works in the museum, but the reason I've put it in is firstly because he is important, but secondly, I have a story connected to this one. Now this is written in Muhaqqaq on the top with Rehan on the bottom, and it's signed down there by Karahisari. So the reason this panel is important to us is because one day my son Khalid was sitting with my father in the kitchen, and he said, okay, if you had to lose everything and could keep only one piece out of the whole museum, what would it be? And so my father chose this. So for us, this is important. And we move on now to the 17th century and Hafiz Osman, or Uthman al-Hafiz. And he was the next key player in Ottoman calligraphy. He was born Osman Den Ali, and born in Istanbul in 1642. His father was a muezzin of a famous mosque called the Haseki Sultan Mosque, which is a beautiful mosque commissioned by the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent and designed by Sinan. Due to his position, Uthman spent much of his time when growing up in the household of the Grand Vizier Mustafa, and this brought his family much privilege and prestige. He memorized the Quran at a very young age, hence his name Hafiz, which means one who's memorized the Quran. And his talents were very evident and noticed by the Grand Vizier, Mustafa Pasha, who was the Pasha known for conquering large parts of Eastern Europe for the Ottoman Empire. And Mustafa Pasha was keen that Uthman receive the best education. So he did under very important scholars and calligraphers. And by the age of 18, he'd qualified and become a teacher. He's considered one of the most important Ottoman calligraphers, coming only second to Sheikh Hamdullah al-Amasi, and he had a very distinctive style of writing, the Nesakh, and his work was based on the styles of both Yaqut and Sheikh Hamdullah. In fact, it was said that Hafiz Osman was at the time the sole possessor of the secrets of Sheikh Hamdullah's calligraphy. He mastered the Thulth and the Nesakh, and in 1694, he was giving calligraphy lessons to the Sultan Mustafa II, seen here, and apparently he gave these lessons wearing the ihram, which is the robes that are worn when one performs the Hajj, as he considered giving these lessons to the Sultan a sacred rite. So the Sultan would choose a certain style of writing that he wished to practice. He would then trace the work done by Hafiz Osman, and once he felt confident enough, he'd produce his own version. Osman also taught Sultans Ahmed II and the Third, and despite this privilege and exceptional royal favor, he also led a very pure and simple life, learnt again through his Sufi training. An anecdote about his humility is one day Hafiz Osman was leaving one of his classes, and a student suddenly turned up late, and he bumped into him in the corridor. And the master asked him the reason for his tardiness, and the student explained that he'd been delayed because of a legal issue. So rather than be annoyed, Hafiz Osman sat him down then and there in the corridor, gave him his lesson, and so he was a very humble man. And another indication of his humility was that he used to give lessons to the poor on Sundays in calligraphy. He's famous for his exquisite accomplishment of the 6 styles of writing. And of course, this caused jealousy too, and there are stories there about that. But one of his most notable creations was what's called the Ottoman Hilyah. And this is a calligraphic work of art containing text that describes the Prophet's traits and appearance. So he formalized the design of the Hilyah. Now the Hilyah, as Hafiz Osman designed it, contained 8 sections, such as this one that we have dated to 1686. The standard layout is 8 sections, so on the top you'd have the Bismillah written. The circular bit in the center would be the description of the Prophet's traits. And then you've got the first four caliphs, al-Khulafa al-Rashidun, and the little circles around that. And below that, a little rectangle with a verse from the Quran. And then at the bottom, there'd be something mentioning the name of the calligrapher plus the date it was written. He produced several hilya and also produced around 25 copies complete of the Quran, which some of which are held in museums in Turkey. At the age of 40, he became paralyzed, probably because of overuse of his hand, but he got some treatment and regained his health, but 3 years later got paralyzed again. Then he died and was buried in quite a famous cemetery. We have a few little pieces by Sheikh Hafiz Osman, including this panel. And this, which is called the Mufradat, which is actually a practice piece written in Thuluth and Nasakh and dated. And this also beautiful Quran from the 17th century, which is beautifully illuminated. Oh, and I didn't have any more pictures of that. So, and finally, our last calligrapher this evening, Sultan Mahmud II. Now, Sultan Mahmud was born in the Topkapi Palace in 1785 AD, and he ruled between 1808 and 1839. And he was one of the rulers who left a significant mark on the Ottoman Empire. It was his ancestor, Suleiman the Magnificent, who started the Ottoman royal tradition of family princes having a trade. So he made his sons learn any trade, carpenter, ironmonger, calligrapher, based on the idea that you may be a prince today, but one never knows what the future holds, and you have to be able to earn a living if suddenly you weren't a prince. Thus, many Ottoman princes and sultans were actually very accomplished calligraphers, and Sultan Mahmud was one of the top 3 in his family. He was very interested in the arts and had a very fine education in poetry and music, as well as in calligraphy. His pen name for his calligraphy was Adli, which is like a signature. That's Sultan Mahmud. So we can see here on this brocade, Adli on the top right, with his Tughra in the middle. And before coming to when he ascended the throne, he started taking lessons from the leading calligrapher of the time, who was called Mustafa Raqam Effendi. And Mustafa Raqam was responsible for reforming and updating the calligraphy style of Hafiz Osman. And so they actually call the periods pre-Raqam and post-Raqam. So his works are considered as being some of the most important in the Turkish calligraphy tradition, and he produced monumental works as well as manuscripts. He came to Istanbul very early on and showed a talent for writing and quickly mastered some of the scripts like Nasakh and Thuluth. One of his other claims to fame were that he introduced a new style of writing the Tughra to the court. He was inspired by the work of Hafiz Osman, which he took and then set down his own rules in terms of proportion and so on. Sultan Mahmud's work is actually very closely intertwined with Raqam's, and in several of the works, the Sultan's Tughra, as well as his honorific Adli, also had the signature of Raqam. So this is actually a portal covering from the Prophet's mosque in Medina, signed by both Sultan Mahmud and Raqam Effendi down there. That's his signature, so that's Sultan Mahmud's Adli with his Tughra, and Raqam's signature down there, which looks like this. And we've actually got a few pieces signed by both of them. Sultan, I mean, we've got two curtains like that. And the Sultan's other signature, scholars say that all the works that are signed by Raqam are the works of Sultan Mahmud before Raqam died. And when he died, it was only then that Sultan would sign his works individually, such as this, in this brocade, which is very long. It's around 7 meters long and came from the interior of the Kaaba in Mecca, designed by Sultan Mahmud. And we also have this panel by Sultan Mahmud, a few other brocades in the museum, and this blue panel, and finally the portal covering from the Kaaba, also Sultan Mahmud, which is in the Calligraphy Museum. And that comes to the end of the talk, and at the end I've got a very unclear, badly taken photograph, but I wanted to put it in because my sister and I did try to photograph it properly, but it was behind a glass panel, which was extremely difficult to remove. So I put it in anyway, and I like it because it has all kinds of writing from Kufic to Ruqa and Diwani and even Syriac at the bottom, and there's some hieroglyphs and well, everything. So I like it particularly. Nothing to do with the lecture, but a beautiful piece of work. And thank you all very much.